right, welcome to episode 13 of the Break podcast. Today is Tuesday, December 18th here in Sydney, Australia, where I am. I'm Stephen Hamblin from the University of New South Wales, and I've got a bunch of co-hosts today and a special guest, so let's get right into it.
Hi, I'm Lauren Reid, a science communicator based in Glasgow in Scotland.
Hi, I'm Morgan Jackson. I'm an entomology PhD student at the University of Guelph in Canada.
Hi, I'm Rafael Maya, I'm a PhD student at the University of Akron, Ohio.
Hi, I'm Tom Housley. I'm a PhD student at the University of Stirling in Scotland.
And we have a special guest with us. So if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself here.
So my name is Jacquelyn Gill. I am a postdoctoral researcher with the Environmental Change Initiative here at Brown University. I just recently finished my PhD at the University of Wisconsin. And I am a paleoecologist and a biogeographer. So that means that I use the tools of time and space to address conservation ecology questions.
Wow, that was a really good description.
You got us all blown out of the water already. Again, every time we have a guest on, it's like we get less and less on this scale, and we're like, all our guests should come back and just be the co-hosts.
Yeah, we try and describe what we do, and it's generally just this. Especially after Tom's been drinking. But
Hey,
so
I got my name almost right last week. It's fine.
So, Jacquelyn, for our audience who may not know much about paleoecology, I know I don't really. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so basically the idea is that the past is this really great natural experiment. We've got extinctions, climate change episodes, species responding to different kinds of disturbances, and so the paleo record allows you to look at how plants and animals and their communities respond to those kinds of disturbances at much longer time spans than it's possible to study as what I would call a neo-ecologist or a modern ecologist. And so depending on your time scale, you can ask different kinds of questions. I work over the Quaternary period, so that's the last 2.8 million years, mostly focusing actually on this last transition from the last ice age to our current interglacial. So really, the last 20,000 years are a really interesting period of time because you've got a lot of climate change, you've got glaciers melting, you have humans arriving in North America for the first time, and the extinction of more than half of the animals larger than an adult German Shepherd, all within a really small period of time. And so you can, by studying that period of time, you're able to make inferences about how the Earth's biota and the Earth system will respond to change in the future.
With all that going on, there must be a lot of signal crammed into a very short window of stuff you can observe. How do you sort all that out?
Yes, that's a really good question. It's what makes the period of time I work in very challenging, but also very interesting. And so you have to be very careful about teasing apart the different kinds of interacting drivers that might be causing the responses that you see. And so there are several ways of doing that. One is by taking an interdisciplinary or a multi-proxy approach. Because we can't directly observe the past, we have to rely on these paleoecological and environmental proxies. That is, they stand for some other process that happened in the past, and we have to work with the tools that the tools we use work with the material that's left behind. So I work, for example, with fossil pollen that I use to reconstruct past plant communities, and fossil charcoal that allows me to reconstruct past fire. And so if you want to do hypothesis testing about these processes in the past, order of events, it becomes really important. You can eliminate certain hypotheses based on what happens first and what follows. And then you can use other tools from different disciplines like phylogeography, modeling, and even modern manipulations and experiments to sort of inform the processes, or to get at the processes that are driving the patterns that we see in the paleo record.
What kind of experiments might you do?
Well, you could do, and so this is actually something that has not been done terribly much in paleoecology, but is something I'm very interested in doing. So, for example, you could grow plants under low CO2 environments to get a sense of how the low CO2 levels of the past would have affected the physiology. You can do herbivory exclusions. Large herbivores is something that I work with quite a bit in the paleo record. People have actually looked at how modern the signal of modern forest fires in the charcoal record to kind of validate things like how far particles of charcoal are dispersed and how well they reflect the area burned or the intensity of fires. So there are some things you can observe in modern systems that can then inform both the tools that we use, especially with linking to things like pollen and what pollen says about tree cover. So both the tools and as well as the processes, or the patterns that we observe.
So I don't know if I'm going to be jumping the gun here, but if I know our audience well, I think one of the things they're going to find most interesting and exciting about your work is that a big part of the inferences and the things that you've discovered are based on, if I remember correctly, the poop of these giant mammals in the past.
Yeah, that's right. So, to sort of to frame that a little bit, to frame the poop, contextualizing the dung. Basically, there's this problem, right, where you have one of the limitations, or I would rather say one of the challenges of working with so many different kinds of data sets is that they each come with their own limitations and their own errors and their own issues. And so, for example, if you want to know something about what large animals have done over these long time scales, you previously have had to look at fossil bones. And fossil bones are fantastic, but they're discontinuous in space and in time. That is, so my vegetation records all come from lake sediments. And so with a lake sediment, you have this nice record of mud that you can pull a core from, just like you would an ice core, and you can extract pollen from different layers. And deeper is older, and so essentially you're reconstructing stratigraphy of vegetation change through time, just like you might read a geologic record. And so I might have a pollen record from a lake that tells me about the regional vegetation, but then to compare that with the animal record, you'd have to go to databases of the fossil bone distributions, and you might have, if you're lucky, there might be 1 or 2 fossil bone assemblages that are anywhere near your site. And so if having one Mammoth's date to compare with my continuous vegetation record is not particularly informative, right? That's in sort of an apples to oranges comparison in terms of proxy data. And so the ideal is to find some sort of material that's preserved in lakes along with the pollen that you can then reconstruct continuously through time and compare directly to the vegetation record. And so what I use now to get to the poop is spores from a fungus that has to go through digestion by herbivores and reproduce on herbivore dung. So when you have lots of these spores in the sediment record, these fungal spores, then you know you have lots of these fungi, which means you have a lot of dung, which is the habitat for the fungi, which means you have a lot of large animals to produce all that dung. And so when you have lots of spores, you can say, all right, we have lots of these, we have a large amount of biomass of these large herbivores. And then when the spores disappear from the record, that's how we can time with relatively good precision the population collapse of these large herbivores like mammoths and giant ground sloths and beaver the size of black bear.
That's really freaking cool.
I think so. Yeah.
So you weren't actually dealing with actual dung. You're using sediments and looking for bits and pieces that would have been representative of dung had you found it, fresh.
Yes, yeah, and that's right. So I'm actually sort of one step removed from the dung. Although there's a really
probably
funny
a good place to be.
Yeah, right. There's a really funny anecdote though, if I can tell a quick anecdote about when some of my work was published. I did an interview with someone or an organization that will remain nameless. I don't think they ever actually aired the television interview because I don't think it went the way they wanted it to go. But the person, so I spoke with this producer beforehand who had no science background at all, and she kept trying to get me to talk about, in her words, the poo. And she really wanted me. So bring it back to the poo. Tell me more about the poo. And I kept trying to explain that I actually don't work with dung. And I kept trying to get her to use the word dung. She just wanted to call it poo. And so she really, this producer really had this image in her mind of, and she communicated this to me, of me diving down to the bottom of the lake, scooping up armloads of poo, swimming valiantly to the surface of the lake and like hauling it onto the shore and being like, here it is, here's the poo. And I was like, no, that's not even remotely close to what I do. It's like, I don't even touch the poo. I was like getting increasingly frustrated. I was like, I don't even touch the poo. I never see the poo. The poo is long gone. The poo is like 15,000 years ago. It just disintegrated. It's not there anymore. And she just was very unhappy. And then at one point, finally in the interview, I thought we'd finally got around this, and the interviewers snuck in this question at the end, and they were like, so how big is mammoth poo? And I was like, I don't know. I was just so frustrated that I kept being asked these questions about stuff that was like, and I was like, I don't know, bigger than rabbit poo? And that was not a very good answer. So that was a bad failure of science communication on my part. I got really frustrated at my inability to sort of bridge this poo gap. So yes, you're correct. Thank you. I don't work firsthand with dung in that context, although I have worked with dung, both fossil and modern, to look for the spores of this fungus in the dung. So I would often get these shipments of dung from other places, and the woman who worked in the front office of my department would get really excited. She's like, you get the best mail, because it'd be like mammoth dung, or giant ground sloth dung. And so she actually thought that was cool.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So do you find that paleoecology as a field has that kind of problem where the public just doesn't understand what you do, and do you have trouble communicating it that way?
I would say sometimes. There are some things that are very much in the public consciousness, right? Like you talk about mammoths and people get very excited, and so that's an obvious direct link where you can get the public very excited about your work. And so I admit to sort of benefiting very directly from the charismatic megafauna concept. Although interestingly, I'm more interested in what the animals did to the plants, right? And so sort of those biotic interactions. But just by virtue of being of association, people tend to think my work is cool. And then poop science is fun, so people like that, as we've discussed. But I would say that there are some challenges, right? Communicating to people the process of taking a sediment core from lakes. Sometimes the ice core analogy is useful because that's something that people see right on the media. It's depicted pretty often. I actually do sometimes use the film The Day After Tomorrow to communicate certain concepts, because that's something that's on people's radar screens. Sometimes I've taken in public talks to reminding people that the species that I'm talking about are the same species that we have on the landscape today, for the most part. That if they had taken a time machine back, they would recognize a spruce tree. They would recognize, sunflowers. They would see the plants and animals that they would see in a modern landscape, with the exception of these really large animals that have gone extinct, and that humans that were around at that time were modern. They were just like us. And so I think that helps. Yeah, I would say sometimes the challenge is getting people to appreciate where the data come from and how we can interpret them, and that something that happened 20,000 years ago is actually really relevant to ecology and to conservation today. So those are the challenges.
Like I can imagine that people would be a lot more interested in the big events, like the big disasters, the KTs, and the end Permian and such like that, big extinctions, big events, and maybe not so much interested in the day-to-day poo.
Yeah.
The daily dung, as it were.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, and certainly I think that's where. So there was recently, in the last few years, a hypothesis that these Pleistocene megafauna were killed off by an impact event similar to the one at the KT, and I think that the reason that hypothesis became really popular in the public is that again, it's the draw of these really large disasters, and so that it's been really difficult then, for example, as more work has come out failing to replicate the original work and sort of pushing back and challenging that hypothesis, that doesn't get picked up by the press, right? Because the lack of evidence for a really sexy explosion is not as exciting to the general public as the evidence for the sexy explosion. And so I think that you're right. Although again, to me, what makes this time period really interesting is that it's so close to modern, right? For me, dinosaurs are interesting, but there was never any chance in hell that I was. Can I say that on the podcast?
Yeah.
Oh, you can say podcast.
There's never a chance.
That'll be the tamest moment. Don't worry about it.
Okay. There's never a chance that I would ever see a dinosaur, right? But to me, what makes these animals so exciting is that they're just there, like on the edge of possibility, right? We could have at one, if things had gone differently, we could have maybe seen a mammoth. And in fact, within the next 5 or 10 years, we probably will, because the Japanese will have one cloned by then. But and we can talk about that too if you want. But yeah, so to me, that actually makes this time period really exciting. And glaciers are awesome.
Actually, I just saw a news story somewhat related to this, and since you're on the podcast, I figure I'll ask you about it. So apparently there's a theory that the end Permian extinction 250 million years ago was caused by methane, in large part because of the cycle where, so this was Daniel Rothman, I think his name is, who from MIT who put out this idea that volcanic eruptions led to huge amounts of nickel in the atmosphere, and somehow the nickel made it to the oceans, where this methane-producing microbe picked it up and started producing massive amounts of methane, and thus contributed to the large extinction event. And I'm wondering, as a paleoecologist, comments.
Yeah, I would say, so this is beyond, I have to give the scientist caveat, right? Like this is beyond my level of expertise. But what I would say is that certainly there's some really cool evidence throughout the paleontological record that the relationship between plate tectonics and the atmosphere is really interesting, and that you can have these sort of tectonic events that then completely change the composition of the atmosphere, but either directly through things like or indirectly through things like weathering, and this idea of nickel sort of I guess fertilizing these methane producing bacteria is a very cool hypothesis. And so, certainly we know that major changes in the atmosphere have been driving forces behind extinctions, both in the past and possibly in the future, whether that's, again, directly because of just the changing composition. We know one of the first mass extinctions occurred because of the production of oxygen, right? That was originally not, as the modern atmosphere was formed, that made it uninhabitable for many organisms that were alive at the time. Or you can also have, sort of these indirect processes through climate change, through global warming. So thinking about those processes as really relevant to modern extinctions, I think, is really interesting. Although it's one thing that's important to remember is that the time scale of those kinds of changes is usually much, much longer. Even one of the more rapid warming periods in the deep time past, the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, where you had this 6-degree warming, and much higher CO2 concentrations. And so people look at that time period and say, hey, it's 6 degrees Celsius warming. That's, like what we're going to expect in the future. But the problem with that is that warming took place probably over about 20,000 years. And that's rapid. That's really rapid from a geological perspective. But what we're talking about now is just, it's not even close in terms of the rate of change. I totally tangented off of your question.
It's totally how this thing works, so.
Is tangent
You clearly have not listened to the podcast before.
I would love for you to talk about cloning mammoths. You touched on that a little bit. Yeah. What's that about?
Yeah. Oh man.
Who's the science communicator here? Great question.
Yeah, no, this is an awesome question. So there are a couple of things about this, right? One is that because of where mammoths live, we have really well preserved carcasses that have DNA in them, and so that's sort of feature number one, is that compared with something like Jurassic Park, it's much more feasible to clone an extinct mammoth because their bodies are melting out of the permafrost. Thanks to climate change, we have now many really great specimens of these animals that are kind of emerging from the ice, and so you've got DNA. And so I think for some scientists that presents this challenge, right? This like, who wants to clone a sheep? When we could clone a mammoth, this is like, the
Totally.
right. It's sort of the example. Yeah, it's like the example of, or the coolest possible example you could think of that's scientifically feasible. And so the Japanese are working on it. And I would be surprised if they weren't successful in the next 5 years, 10 at the most. The other thing that's interesting about that is that there's a sort of conservation imperative for some people, where if you believe that humans caused the extinction of the mammoths and the other megafauna, then you could make an argument that we have a duty, and this isn't my argument, this is just one that I'm repeating, but we have sort of a duty to erase that mistake or fix that mistake. And if it was climate change, then that's a natural process, right? We don't have to, we're not responsible. And so there's a team of scientists that have cordoned off a couple hundred square kilometers in Siberia called Pleistocene Park. And they've put some analogs of these extinct animals into the park. And the park is designated to be the sort of the habitat for the mammoths when they're cloned. And so we'll put the mammoths in Pleistocene Park. This is serious. I'm not making this up.
So what type of analogs?
They've got some sort of muskox type animals roaming around there right now. Europe had woolly rhinos. There were all sorts of really big animals that could stick in there. They might have some horses. There are a number of extinct animal or species of horses. But the idea is that if you can stick the mammoth in Pleistocene Park in an interglacial climate, like the one we live in now, we're in a warm period, then you can make the argument and prove with science that climate change didn't kill off the megafauna because, look, we have these mammoths and they can live here today. Therefore, it had to have been humans. So people are arguing that it's an opportunity for hypothesis testing. Yeah.
That is the best thing I've heard all week. I think we should all look into funding for cloning our own mammoths.
Are we talking a Kickstarter here?
Yeah.
That's something that actually kind of surprises me of this, because so you're talking about a Japanese group that is trying this, right?
Yeah, and I think the Russians might be as well, but I definitely know the Japanese are.
Yeah, because I would imagine that there would be like dozens of lab groups going ape shit.
To continue with the theme, right?
The broken English, yeah. But I mean, I'd imagine there would be several labs very excited about this possibility.
Oh yeah, I'm sure there are. I think for some people it falls into the territory of this is not something that we mess with, right? Like you don't. There are really interesting moral debates that need to happen, and the ethicists should get involved about cloning extinct taxa. In fact, one other debate that's kind of started to emerge is, as we have completed the Neanderthal genome, should we clone Neanderthals? One again, to get back at this hypothesis testing example, there's been some debate about whether Neanderthals had speech, and certainly their genetics and their physiological makeup suggest that they had the capacity for speech, but we don't know if they actually had language or if they talked. And so it's been suggested that we could clone Neanderthals and see if they could speak. But they're humans, right? I mean, they're not Homo sapiens, but they're hominins. So then this gets at all these really interesting ethical dilemmas about can you versus should you?
Where do you draw the line?
Where do you draw the line, right? And I mean, and some folks would certainly argue that why would we make the effort to clone mammoths when we have endangered elephants or endangered white rhinos or these other taxa that we're having a really hard time keeping a handle on in terms of conservation funding and efforts, and certainly, I mean, I want to know is 200 square kilometers or however large this reserve is that even large enough to sustain a population of mammoths? And is one mammoth in isolation really a mammoth? Because these were communal, I mean, these were species that lived as a society, right? They were just like elephants today. They had communities, presumably based on what we can tell from the fossil record. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can already see the Hollywood movie where the population of mammoths runs wild and destroys a neighboring city or something.
There is a disaster movie called Mammoth.
Of course there is.
And the mammoth melts out from the permafrost and it wants revenge for being killed, right? for the extinction. Yeah. So it's kind of
zombie mammoths are awesome.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. I mean, just speaking for myself, I would totally buy a ticket for Paleo Place or Paleo Land or whatever.
Pleistocene Park.
Well, that's the thing, right? I would too. I actually don't know that as it stands, I'm not comfortable with the moral implications of it, but I would still be on the first plane to Siberia, if you can take a plane there, to see it, right? And the other thing that I wonder about is how long would it be before we had Pleistocene game parks? Can you imagine? Because can you imagine the big game hunting folks? Because there are game preserves in North America that have elephants in them, right? Where people just can go or maybe not elephants, but they can go and shoot these big exotic game on these private reserves. So I can imagine. I mean, can you really believe that it wouldn't turn into a money-making enterprise?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, it would certainly remove their moral inhibition to hunting if they felt they could just resurrect any species they hunted to extinction.
Right.
Especially if it's something cloned, right? I mean, just in terms of like the image that you can, the excitement that you can generate in people. I mean, that's probably the closest thing you'd ever have in biology to what the man walking in the moon was for engineering or physics. And so, I mean, it's just something that would be in the public mindset for decades. And I don't know.
Right.
We've had that before, right? I mean, the Human Genome Project was a huge news getter at the time, right?
I don't think the general public really go for the Human Genome Project quite as much as they would for fucking
a big ass fucking huge furry mammoth would probably be more exciting.
Or a little baby, a cute little baby, Pleistocene Parks had its first mammoth calf,
Exactly.
Just like the pandas. Whenever the pandas reproduce, man, it's like
all the
crazy
webcams would be epic.
Oh yeah, the mammoth cam. Someone has to come along periodically and scrape the ice off of the.
No, I don't doubt that would be a huge draw. I just think that we've had man on the moon moments in biology before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I don't think
more man on the airplane. And some man on the moon.
That'll be the next one. Snakes on a plane, mammoths on a plane. So I was just going to ask, because you brought up the point that a lot of the plants that we have in North America in particular are the ones that you're studying in the pollens and stuff like that. And in some cases, these plants we are assuming are declining because some of these big megafauna have disappeared. So could you make the argument about almost like a mammoth reintroduction or a megafauna reintroduction to North America, akin to some of the bison work that has been done to help save some of these ecologies?
Yeah, so that argument has actually already been made by others. Folks like Josh Donlan have argued for Pleistocene rewilding. That is, in the absence of these large herbivores, that we should bring in their closest analogs, like elephants, like lions, certainly rewilding horses. Many people don't know that horses and camels were native to North America and then went extinct here. They crossed the land bridge into Eurasia and then expanded, and so you could bring horses and camels or wild populations of them into North America. There are certainly active rewilding efforts in Europe. A lot of the Europeans have gotten really into some of this kind of work in places like Denmark and the Czech Republic, where they have these really big wildlife reserves where you have the idea is that you need these large animals to create the kinds of ecosystem structure, these open parkland type forests. Certainly in parts of the tropics, there's been some work, or at least some thought experiments on the importance of these large animals in terms of dispersal of these large seeded, really fleshy fruits that are just much bigger than any animal, any modern animal, or would allow for any modern animal to disperse them. And so, in theory, these plants should have much more restricted ranges than their climate space would allow them to expand into, because they're dispersal limited. And certainly North America doesn't have as many as the tropics, but in North America we have things like the Osage orange and the honey locust and the pawpaw tree, all of which produce these very big fruits. So if you've ever been anywhere in the Great Plains or the South and seen these Osage orange trees, they basically are like trees with giant tennis balls on them. You know, they will fall down onto the sidewalk. And but those are thought to have been dispersed by some extinct species because horses ignore them. They're nothing a human would want to eat. So, and if you go to like a honey locust, I mean, they have these huge, really sticky, sweet seed pods. But the tree, if you look at the bark of the bowl of the tree itself, the trunk, it has these really long spines, and so it's obviously protecting itself from or from some herbivore getting too close. So it's like, eat my seed pods, but don't knock me down. There's just nothing that it needs to worry about on the landscape today. And so certainly the bison work has suggested that to get a prairie to do the kinds of things we want prairies to do in terms of their biodiversity, a combination of fire and grazing are increasingly important. And we know that cows are not necessarily good analogs for bison, that bison do certain things on the landscape that their cousins don't. And so there's some suggestion that certain kinds of species, certain kinds of landscapes rely on these keystone herbivores, and that might be a viable part, or might be an important part of your conservation strategy if you want it to be viable.